Uh, on behalf of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, it's my pleasure to extend a very, very warm welcome this afternoon to this public lecture. I extend welcome to all those who are present here in the seminar hall with us and those who have joined us online. We have the great pleasure of having with us today Professor Madhu Bhalla, who is going to speak on China's multilateral thrust under Xi Jinping. Will it reshape the global order? Professor Madhu Bhalla is a well-known expert in the field. She was professor in Chinese studies at the Department of East Asian Studies, Delhi University, and has now retired. Before joining Delhi University in 2005, she taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and Queen's University, Canada. She's a prolific writer, has written many books. Her latest edited volume titled Culture as Power, Buddhist Heritage, and the Indo-Japanese Dialogue came from Routledge in 2021. So, welcome to Nehru Memorial, ma'am. Then, the topic of her lecture today, China's multilateral thrust under Xi Jinping, will it reshape the global order, is of great relevance for India and the world, as we all know. We are aware that in the last 20 years, China's talk, or we call it rhetoric, about how multilateralism is important for the world as well as for China has been around. And in the last decade or so, China has changed its course in so many ways. But as far as this talk of multilateralism is concerned, it remains an important part of Chinese foreign policy articulation. And I was just talking to Professor Bhalla before we came here. It seems that this multilateralism that China is proposing is in a way aimed at the creation of what I believe she will argue is a new global order after discarding the old world order, as we call it. So multilateralism in a way uh, is at the center of Chinese attempt to become the dominant or the hegemonic power in Asia Pacific, Indo Pacific, and of course the world at large, or at least become the second dominant power, which many would say it has already become. So it's an extremely relevant topic, as I said, because China is the most important factor in the world today. China has been rising for the last many decades, but in the last uh, decade or so, especially after 2008, certainly China's rise has been phenomenal, and it is recognized by almost all countries of the world. So, with these very few words, I would once again like to welcome Professor Bhalla and request her to deliver her lecture. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra, for inviting me to give this lecture. It's always a pleasure to come to Teen Murti, and it's wonderful outside. So I'm really quite surprised that so many of you are sitting in the room here. It's really very nice outside. I was telling Ravi, I said it's always nice to come to Teen Murti. It's always very nice at this time of the year. But to more serious matters, I will speak today on China's new multilateralism. And I say new multilateralism because what I'm positing here is that since Xi Jinping took over in the 18th Party Congress, and especially since the 19th Party Congress, when he had consolidated more or less his domestic issues, there has been a new projection, I would say, of China's assertiveness in the multilateral order, and definitely a new definition of how China sees the multilateral order. I have a paper here, and maybe a PowerPoint would have been better, but not really. I'm sort of old-fashioned in that I don't do PowerPoints. So I'm going to read from my paper, and hopefully, because we are a small group here, we can have many questions later on. Right? Just to set the background for multilateralism, it's an engagement that is driven by self-interest, and we know that, by the need to minimize transaction costs, increase information and expertise, ensure cooperation, and formalize rules. But multilateral institutions also act as sites of power. And this has become very, has been very relevant to the leading powers before this, and certainly now to China. And they are reflective of power hierarchies and interests. More important, multilateral engagements allow nations to write new narratives. And this is really very important for China today about themselves and escape tropes of marginalization or hegemony and threat. It is not surprising, therefore, that multilateral institutions in their decline or rise best reveal the contours of emerging power conflicts and challenges, and new alliances which threaten to outmode critical institutions. And not surprising as well that rising or revisionist powers find multilateral institutions best suited to their strategic and political intent to shape the world in their own interests. An examination of China's multilateral policy reveals many of these aspects and should alert us to its global ambitions. Despite the retreat from multilateralism by leading Western creators of multilateral institutions, China's support for multilateralism has been very outspoken. Right through since it has joined the United Nations in the mid 1970s. And this stems from three concerns that China has always had: stability, it's always wanted a stable external environment, power, and prosperity. Concerns over these remain closely intertwined in the PRC's policy, but the language of China's leaders indicates that while prosperity and stability have been the more important issues at stake in its policies over the last 2 decades, power seems to occupy a more central position as shifts in global power become apparent. As a consequence, Beijing's response to multilateralism has changed. In the first 2 decades, China viewed multilateral institutions as instruments for integrating with the global economy and remained mute for the most part on inequities within multilateral institutions. It was also a driving force behind new institutions with selective memberships where the nation's regional economic and security interests were at stake, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, etc., but did not project them, and this is important really, did not project them as standing outside the larger multilateral framework. The emergence from a more assertive approach to multilateralism stems from two parallel events: Xi Jinping's declaration of the third era in China's modern history, which is really a recognition of China's great power status, and the American effort to contain China's growing influence and power at a period of American domestic and external disarray. The first sign of this occurred at the Davos meeting in 2017, when the absence of Trump unnerved the world. The continued blowback to globalization. As Beijing's effort to manage its relationship with the United States failed, Beijing's positions on reshaping older institutions and leading in newer ones were more sharply defined. So far, Beijing had kept mute because it felt it could actually, through multilateral arrangements, manage its relationship with the US. And when that actually failed completely in the last few years, in a two-pronged strategy, China now intermeshed political and economic strategies to cope with resistance to its rise. In a system where it had economic power but still lacked effective political or hard power. Hence, since Xi Jinping's ascent to power, the tone, focus, and direction of multilateral policy have changed. Xi has invested the country's reputation as a major power and hopes for meeting his 20th century goals in a new calibration of the definition of multilateralism. This new definition is cast in a distinctly Chinese garb for what Xi has termed, quote unquote, the new era in his 19th Party Congress work report. And in the context of criticism of China's trade and security policies more recently in the last 2 years, Xi has mounted a full-scale counterattack on the existing US-led world order and proposed a new framework for an emerging global order. He has called out the old order as neither global, excluding as it did the voices of the majority, nor fair and just in the application of its rules and principles, and instead offered an inclusive, cooperative structure for dialogue, one that is shaped by quote unquote universal rules, written quote unquote jointly by all countries, leading to a quote unquote community of shared interests, peculiarly Chinese phrase, turning to ancient Chinese history for the values and principles of the new multilateral order. Chinese scholars like Xu Qilin, and this is really interesting because Chinese scholars have been preparing the ground for a Chinese view of the world for quite some time. Have also suggested that the notion of Tianxia, which is all under heaven, be viewed as an alternative notion of an ideal civilizational order and a world spatial imaginary. It also provides a peculiarly Chinese conception of universalist values overriding narrow self-interest. Xu argues that the decentered and non-hierarchical Tianxia 2.0 would be the basis for a new order. At the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping also offered the Chinese model as one that could be emulated. And he said the path, the theory, the system, and the culture of socialism with Chinese characteristics offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. And it offers Chinese wisdom and a Chinese approach to solving the problem facing mankind. The Chinese dream, he suggested, and that's one of his, apart from the BRI, one of his signature initiatives, one of his signature conceptions, he suggested cannot be achieved alone. It is closely connected with the dreams of the people of other countries. And I'm quoting here from him, a clear refutation of the exceptionalism of the American dream and its liberal values. Xi Jinping's recourse to Chinese history, cultural traditions, and China's socialist model rewrite the narratives about China in the 21st century. China now is one capable of contributing universal values, successful models of development, and ethical universal principles leading to global stability. Thus, China's multilateralism now has more strategic overtones, projects a decidedly Chinese conceptual framework, and a China-led global reach. In China, these initiatives are generally advocated as an economic outreach to the world community, a contribution to the common good, but they are fundamentally political. They challenge the hierarchy of the post-Second World War world order, quote unquote, with claims to a more democratic global order, quote unquote, and conceptions consciously derived from the Chinese view of universal ethical values. And more importantly, and this is critical for Chinese thinkers and policymakers, they elide the Thucydides trap, most often associated with major power shifts, by suggesting a virtuous circle of economic cooperation and strategic stability, as opposed to the neoliberal one of marketization and democracy. This is in keeping with China's own assessment of its own global status and power, and the global geopolitical changes afoot last seen at the beginning of the 20th century. So China has a long historical view of things. It thinks in terms of centuries, many centuries. What exactly are China's multilateral policies? First of all, I think China regards the United Nations as the world's foremost and most significant multilateral institution. It's not one that China made, it's one that China signed up to, but certainly it's one that China has taken the most advantage of in terms of its integration with the global economy, its integration with the world, with world institutions. Since joining the UN in the mid-1970s, Beijing has used the UN as a sounding board, a place for institutional learning, and a forum to advance its economic and political interests. Until recently, China was more active in the UN and its bodies on development and economic issues. With Xi Jinping, its focus has shifted also to political and security issues, in keeping with Xi's political vision and the country's broader strategic interests. The UN is also viewed as more democratic than other post-war multilateral institutions, and hence more legitimate, and this is important, as a multilateral body. This, despite the UN Security Council being a select club, now generally seen as outmoded by those who stand outside it. Speaking at the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly in 2021, she made probably the first clear refutation of the world order, the old world order, as defined by the post-World War II powers. And I'm quoting him, in the world, he said, there is only one international system, i.e. the international system with the United Nations at its core. There is only one international order, i.e. the international order underpinned by international law. There is only one set of rules, i.e., the basic norms governing international relations underpinned by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Nothing could have been clearer as a refutation of any order outside of the United Nations order. So China has now been proactive in the UN bodies since she took over, more proactive than it was earlier. China's contribution to the United Nations now stands at 12% of its budget, of the UN's budget, as compared to 22% by the US and 8.5% by Japan. And of course, China pays up, whereas the US doesn't often pay up. Its contribution to the UN's peacekeeping budget is 15%, second after the US at 27%. And it has in the peacekeeping arrangements about 2,500 troops and other personnel in peacekeeping missions, more than the other P5 combined. So while China started late, it has caught up much beyond the other powers. Chinese nationals also had 4 of the UN specialized bodies: the Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO, the International Telecommunications Union, or the ITU, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, or UNIDO, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. Why are these important? These are important because they set standards and practices which could affect national commerce, economic policy, and security concerns. So China stands at the head of many of these bodies, which are standard setting and can influence the standards that they set. Yet, of greater concern to China's critics is Beijing's influence in the political affairs section of the United Nations, which is related to global peace and security, especially since Xi's advent to power in China. China contributed $1 billion to the Fund for Peace and Development of the United Nations, $100 million for the African Union Standby Peacekeeping Force in this period. Currently, China has at least 2 nationals in leadership positions in UN peacekeeping operations, and China has begun to scrutinize appointments of special envoys, which it did not do before, as representatives in peacekeeping operations, unlike in the past. A lot of this has to do with the fact that China differs on the objectives of peacekeeping. And China, unlike Western states, does not take a human rights position on conflict in many areas in Africa, etc. So there's a wide difference between how China looks at peacekeeping and why UN should be going to peacekeeping orbits, and how the West looks at that. But the most important thing, and it's very interesting actually, China has managed to merge she has managed to merge, I should say, his signature initiative, the BRI, with the goals of the SDGs in the United Nations. And it's not surprising that given China's influence in United Nations bodies, the Director General of the United Nations at the first forum of the BRI in China actually announced that the SDGs and the BRI would be, the aims of the SDGs and the BRI would be merged. So officially, the United Nations has accepted China's signature initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is a first for any country, actually, if you look at the UN's record. In the United Nations, of course, China holds this as a primary multilateral institution. It's been very active and is trying to shape this. The second institution that China holds to be very important in the old multilateral order, as well as in the new multilateral order that it wants to shape, is the World Trade Organization. And there is a battle on to shape the global economic regime through reforms in the WTO. The WTO is something that China sees as being central to a democratic, rules-based order. When China signed up to the WTO in 2001, it did so knowing full well that the advantages would be greater than the cost of the less than satisfactory deal it was offered. And China was offered a really bum deal, actually. In subsequent years, this understanding held well, and China has asserted the importance of the WTO to a non-discriminatory global economic order regime. Since 2001, China has displayed considerable activism. It has become a member of coalitions pushing for its own interests, like the G20 and G33 at the Doha negotiations. In Over the years, it has been much more active and made greater use of the dispute settlement body, the DSP. And from 2004 to 2019, China had 15 cases as complainant, 39 cases as respondent, and 114 cases as a third party. It has also increasingly voiced its concerns about the tendency of developed countries to use national legislation unilaterally to undermine the commitments of the WTO and weaken it as a multilateral institution. And not the least of China's concern has been over attacks on China's trade policies. The latest example has been the US administration's annual trade policy report to Congress and to counteract China's unfair advantage related to dumping, particularly in steel as well as aluminum and chemical products. Yet, despite greater assertion, uh, China has been reluctant in the past to seek a leadership role to avoid the costs that it might entail in the domestic development agenda. This is no longer true. Ever since the open attack and the tariff wars started by Trump and then carried on by the Biden administration, uh, China has taken a much more aggressive role, suggesting specific reforms to the WTO. One of the problems, of course, has been that the WTO has been subject to American opposition to its appellate functions and obstructions in appointing members of the appellate body, which is a dispute settlement body, crippling its most important function, which was a dispute resolution function. More recently, it has also created an impasse by breaking the consensus on the appointment of the new WTO Director General. There is unanimous agreement that the WTO needs reforms to be able to provide economic governance and now faces an existential crisis. China finds itself at odds with those who want a complete overhaul of the institution. And this is a small group of Western powers which feel that the one vote, one decision making system, the consensus system is not the way to go with the WTO because it creates impasse. And it also feels, and this is also the group that feels that new definitions of developing and developed countries should now be part of the WTO's decision-making process, right? So China finds itself at odds with those who want a complete overhaul and insisting that the dispute resolution mechanism be addressed first to address tariff wars. Um, it also feels that protectionism and the use of national security measures by developed nations is unfair. And an additional issue is the pace of WTO negotiations, where rules often become obsolete and need to be changed. Hence, China in November 2018 put forward the following three basic principles on WTO reform. First, the reform shall preserve such core values of the multilateral trading system as non-discrimination and openness, with a view to creating a stable and predictable environment for international trade. It's very, very important for China. It's an export-led economy, it's a trading economy, and tariff wars and slapping of tariff barriers on China, non-tariff barriers as well, mitigates against an open and free trading system as far as China is concerned. Secondly, the reform shall safeguard the development interests of developing members. And this is a conflict that China has had with the West, where the West now sees China as a developed country and not any longer as a developing country, considering its GDP. In particular, it is imperative to eliminate development deficit in the existing WTO rules, resolve the difficulties encountered by developing members in their integration, and thirdly, the reform shall follow the practice of decision making by consensus. And this is significant because of the role of the US in stymieing the functions of the WTO. So, but that does not mean, and this is something that Chinese policymakers have stated very clearly, that though they suggest these reforms and they suggest that the WTO should be strengthened, it does not mean that China will give up its identity as a developing country and blindly pursue what China has called the three zeros of trade: zero tariffs, zero market barriers, zero subsidies. And this is something that China will never do, which is not only unfair to China, but also unfair to developing countries. So this is a position that China has in the WTO, and it's a position that is diametrically opposed to the major European powers, which are also members of the WTO. And China's insistence on putting forward these reforms And also lobbying with developing country members in support of these reforms has become a very significant aspect of WTO dialogues today. So, while the UN, the WTO, and the G20 are important platforms for equal engagement as far as China is concerned, the new forces of the existing international mechanism, I quoted China here, are the multilateral mechanisms such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS countries, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Of course, the BRI is being cited, the Belt and Road Initiative, is being cited as China's contribution as the biggest public good, and this is China's terms for it, which adds to, quote unquote, concept of international economic cooperation and practice of multilateralism. So clearly China is beginning to look at new institutions that it is creating in which it leads as creating new practices, new multilateral practices. In the newly established institutions, China has a larger political and economic stake. It makes the largest of equal financial contributions, and it is not hemmed in by unequal structures of decision making. And by virtue of its economic and military heft, has fairly well recognized claims to leadership. And this is significant for China because in the Bretton Woods institutions, in the IMF and in the World Bank, which create global financial regimes, it has not had a leadership position. The move from rule taker to that of rule maker means that China's ability to craft a multilateral order outside the older multilateral institutions, as well as its ability to create alternative informal and loose multilateral interactions outside the formal institutions, albeit supported by them, is on full display. And we see that with the global financial regime, for example. We are used to thinking about, sorry, this is my seasonal allergy. We are used to thinking about the global financial regime in terms of the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and the World Bank. And yet, the IMF and the World Bank, as we all know, are terribly skewed in terms of representation, in terms of decision making. And it's basically a division between Europe and the United States, where for one term, if an American is head of the World Bank, a European is head of the IMF. And there never has been any other alternative to this arrangement. The other thing, of course, for the Bretton Woods institutions is that they have conditionalities for countries that seek assistance from them. And very often these conditionalities are deemed to be unfair by countries in which they are slapped. We saw this in the 1998 financial crisis, Asian financial crisis, where the IMF's position on conditionalities in Malaysia and in Thailand. In Thailand, of course, it absolutely ruined its economy, and in Malaysia, it was actually challenged by Mahathir as being untenable. So increasingly, these Bretton Woods institutions have been challenged by non-Western powers in terms of the conditionalities that they impose. But they have been central to a stable financial global regime so far. But because of the skewed representation of developing countries and emerging economies, China, along with others, has often demanded reform of the global financial architecture. The main rationale driving such demands is the asymmetry in terms of representation and the failure in accommodating the increased economic influence in the global economy, especially that of the emerging economies. When reforms were made in the IMF in 2010 as on quotas, and these quotas were actually reforms and quotas were actually pushed by the United States, it did enhance China's position and role in that institution, with China's share rising from 3.72 to 6.39, almost double, and the right to vote from 3.65% to 6.07%, third after the US and Japan. In the World Bank, China's voting power was increased from third after the US and Japan, increased from 2.77% to 4.42%, and again third after the US and Japan. However, the distance between China's rights and those of the US was an indicator of the lesser role that China could play. And the implementation of the reforms was also very tardy. While the decision was taken in 2010, it was not ratified by the US till 2015. And China continues to be underrepresented with respect to the weight of its economy. Um, the interesting part was that after the quota reforms, IMF and the World Bank moved into dialogues uh, and creating agencies for surveillance, evaluation, and action on financial instability to action on bailing out European economies like Greece in the Eurozone crisis. So, as the financial crisis increased, it was 1998, and now that was just the Asian financial crisis. In 2008 was really the subprime crisis, which affected all of the Western economies. And China there was actually a savior for many of these economies. By 2011, the head of the IMF was suggesting that the renminbi, that the Chinese yuan, be added to the special drawing rights basket of global currencies. And yet there was a problem. You can't have a global currency which is not convertible. And China's currency was not convertible. So therefore, there was a problem with the evaluation of the yuan, with the ability of China to make its currency convertible. And China was very reluctant to do so. So China still stood at the margins of the financial global regime. But interestingly, you know, China soon found that the World Bank was extremely bureaucratic. It was tardy. Its conditionalities were unacceptable, and it felt, and gradually it felt it created institutions that would parallel IMF funding for Africa, especially. It came to a point where a lot of African nations who were offered World Bank funds refused to take them because China's conditions were much more easy to live with. And it actually encouraged the World Bank to get rid of a lot of bureaucratic red tape and reform itself in terms of its lending policies. So more recently, China has become an important donor to the concessional window of the World Bank, right? So the World Bank decided to take China on board, which finances the poorest countries, mostly in Africa. At the most recent replenishment in December 29, China was the sixth largest donor behind the United Kingdom, Japan, the United States, Germany, and France, and ahead of G7 members, Canada and Italy. While China's relationship with the World Bank has largely been positive, it does have criticism of the bank's shift away from infrastructure and growth, and of its slow preparation times and costly bureaucracy. And as a consequence, to overcome some of these anxieties, some of these concerns, China then pushed for the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right, as a new multilateral development bank, and one that has attracted by now over 100 members and is off to a good start working closely with the existing development banks. So it didn't actually break away. He actually created an alternative structure that works with the World Bank, but works also tangentially and parallelly to the World Bank, and is gaining much more heft, I think, in many more countries in Africa, Latin America, etc. It's also in Asia in terms of infrastructure needs and in terms of development needs. So it's actually bridging that development deficit that it felt the IMF and the World Bank should have done. The problem, though, is that while China has set up its AIIB, and of course it's a multilateral bank because other countries also have a stake in that and have contributions to make in that, China has been very, very reluctant to sign on to stipulations that make its dealings transparent. So therefore, in the WTO, China has dragged its feet on its commitment years ago to join the government procurement arrangement, which is mostly a club of rich countries that have opened up government procurement markets to each other. And China is also reluctant to see the WTO take on new issues such as cross-border data flows, IPR protection, subsidies, and investment. So in a sense, much of the way in which China functions commercially is still opaque, is still under the table, is not transparent, and much of that impinges on how the BRI also has begun to function today and the complications within the Belt and Road Initiative. The issue of government procurement arrangement is that China's economy is, a large part of China's economy is state-owned economy. And a large part of the government procurement, therefore, is between enterprises, state-owned enterprises, and are not open to private investors. And so, therefore, the problem with signing on to a government procurement arrangement, a multilateral government procurement arrangement, would be to have to reform its state-owned enterprises. And Xi Jinping has absolutely no intention of reforming or getting out of the business of the state. So, in many ways, therefore, China has also been reluctant to join the OECD, which sets standards for transparency of foreign aid, or the Paris Club, which coordinates official debt reschedulings. And this has actually implications for how China deals with other nations in the BRI, on the Belt and Road Initiative, because where the kind of funding it does, the kind of loans it gives, it's terribly opaque, and nobody quite knows what the debt of these countries is to China anymore. The interesting part about China's multilateral engagements is that while China espouses multilateral engagements and multilateral institutions, within these institutions, a lot of China's dealings are actually bilateral, right? For example, in the BRI, China has signed on with individual states, although many states have signed on to the BRI initiative. Okay? But its dealings with each state are at a bilateral level. So it's not as if China was. It's not like a truly multilateral body where decision making is a collective, act, and where policies are collectively defined. Its extensive, therefore, bilateral economic relations often undermine its global contributions and also undermine its multilateral thrust. The clearest example is in development finance. It is a major contributor to the World Bank's concessional window, as we said, has started the AIB and supports the IMF's debt sustainability approach. At the same time, through the Belt and Road Initiative, it is lending 40 to 50 billion per year to developing countries for projects in transport and power infrastructure. While the financing amount is large, the terms are largely commercial. They are not loans, it's not aid, it's not even loans at very substantially low interest. The whole effort lacks transparency in terms of selection of contractors, amounts lent, detailed terms, and environmental and social sustainability. She has never tried to hide this. Has never made an excuse for this. In the report of the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping described his vision of multilateralism as, quote unquote, dialogue without confrontation, partnership without alliance, indicating that China opposes universally binding rules for international cooperation, but will interact with other countries through bilateral consultations. A most recent example is the G20's attempt to agree on a multilateral solution for debt relief for COVID-19 affected countries in Africa. China stated that it supports multilateral decisions to help low-income countries respond appropriately to debt risk issues and is ready to maintain communication with the affected countries through bilateral channels. So any kind of a multilateral approach to a global problem is something that China finds extremely binding, and he finds that it constrains its flexibility of action. In the financial realm, in the financial global regime domain, 2008 was actually a wake-up call for China vis-a-vis global financial controls. European and American financial vulnerabilities were in full play, and China came to the rescue with a more proactive policy. However, US also opposed the creation of alternative financial institutions, and this meant that its multilateral initiatives were confined within the ASEAN regional framework. So there's the Chiang Mai Initiative, for example, and various other currency swap initiatives which were localized and regional. Opinion within China veered to a critique of the US as exercising control of global financial markets and policy, including that of China. And I'm quoting here from a very important essay that was written in 2013. After 30 years of reform and opening up, China is now in a danger zone where the US and the US dollar control the world economic order. A commentary in the influential Chinese journal Chuxi noted. For China, the issue is one of retaining power over its future. Thus, they went on. The US has started to use its slaying the dragon strategy against China. At top level design, as top level design has become a hot topic, we should ask, what is the highest level of China's economy? Is China becoming a colony of international capital? When the members of the US military place their military and political focus in the Asia Pacific region, are they trying to assist their fight for the control of the highest level of China's economy? These questions are critical to the development of the Chinese economy for the future. So clearly, there was a whole school of thought that looked at the global financial regime and protested the consequences of the control of the dollar on the Chinese economy, the control of the Federal Reserve, for example, in being able to affect interest rates across the world and of the yuan as well, and the pressure that the Americans put on the yuan to reevaluate the yuan. One of China's most important and most, what shall I say, most the multilateral initiative that China most celebrates is the China-Africa Forum. Okay? And yet, again, as we saw with other multilateral institutions where China actually deals bilaterally, the China-Africa Forum, although China has invested a lot of money in it and has also used all of its financial institutions, the Import Bank, China Bank, etc., in giving loans to China and to African states, again functions at a bilateral level. It is not a multilateral institution. China holds the forum meetings every 2 years, and parades a huge array of African leaders who come to the forum, and yet all the deals are worked out bilaterally. So there is no collective decision making. There is no input from African states as to their needs in a collective fashion in terms of more regional or African development, but China deals with each state individually. And aid to Africa is now rooted. So China has actually increased the money that it has invested in Africa, in the Africa Forum. It used to be USD 5 billion and doubled by Xi Jinping in 2016. And aid to Africa is now rooted to the China Export-Import Bank, China Africa Development Fund, which is a new fund set up for this reason, and the more recently instituted Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, as well as to China's state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. So these are essentially commercial deals that China makes with African states, and they are the conditions are set by its own financial institutions. Between 2000 and 2014, Chinese banks, contractors, and the government loaned more than 86 billion to Africa. China also pledged 100 million to the African Union Standby Force at the United Nations and 1 billion to establish the UN Peace and Development Trust Fund for the African states. So China's investment in Africa has grown exponentially, but again, it is a double-edged. Investment. One route is through the United Nations, but the other route and the larger route is actually through the agencies of the Chinese state. I'm just going to take 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Right? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I will not go into a discussion of the BRI here to a large extent. I think at an earlier paper that I made here, I sort of said what I needed to say on that, but we can talk about it in question hour. Briefly, really, the BRI as well. The BRI has been posited as a geopolitical framework for China's outreach into Asia and Africa and also Europe. Well, China has had many opportunities. It has presented China with many opportunities to basically extend its economic model outside of China, to extend its investments outside of China, and to actually deposit its what shall we say, extra commodities and products outside of China, and ask its enterprises which are not viable in China to invest in Central Asia, etc. The challenges are also immense because once these enterprises go abroad, most states find that the transfer of technology is a transfer of very old technology. For example, China exports coal-fired plants rather than alternative energy plants, so it's actually undermining its commitments to the Paris Climate Agreement. Older technologies, which are also more expensive in the long run. And in many states, what China has done is where it has actually transferred newer surveillance technologies. It has done so in the interest of creating what it calls safe cities, which are basically surveillance centers for the collection of data from states like Kyrgyzstan, for example. And this data goes back to China, which China can then use to be able to fashion commercial policy or security policies vis-a-vis these states. So the whole way of functioning in the BRI is, since it is not transparent, it becomes very questionable, and many states have raised protests and accused Chinese firms of cutting corners, ignoring safety standards, using second-hand or low-quality materials and equipment, and building environmentally destructive projects. A recent book by Jonathan Hillman on the BRI also suggests, and he visited 13 countries where there were supposed to be BRI projects, also suggests that some of the projects were already there and just were named as BRI projects. Elsewhere, where they are stated to have been started, they have not yet started. And thirdly, where new projects have started, there is no infrastructure around them to make them actually viable. So in a sense, the BRI is coming up against a whole host of challenges. But this is not to say that the Chinese will not work through these challenges given time. However, and this is the interesting thing, the BRI, as I said before, is not a multilateral venture, although China has suggested and has projected it as a multilateral venture. It is essentially a bilateral arrangement between China and various different countries. China also has security-linked multilateral ambitions, right? And the interesting part, of course, is that for quite a while, the building blocks for this framework existed in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ARF, and in the UN. But China is also keen to shape and to drive the regional security process. And to that end, we find that, in 1998, China announced a defense white paper and spelled out a new security concept. The regional security, a new security concept. And a couple of years later, in 2014, it came out with the notion that the problems of Asia be solved by Asia alone, Asia for Asia, for Asians proposal. And in 2017, in the aftermath of a series of contentious policy moves in the Asia-Pacific region, China felt that regional anxieties were rising in relation to its security initiatives, and it sought to create a more reassuring image. In its white paper on China's policies in Asia-Pacific security cooperation, it stated its past record in creating and committing to regional and sub-regional cooperative security dialogues. And it also highlighted its role as a responsible member of the Asia-Pacific community and its commitment to peace building in the region. Now, much of this, of course, went against what was happening on the ground, which was China's much more expansive irredentist policies vis-a-vis territorial claims in South China Sea with Japan and also with South Korea. Although China insisted, and the rhetoric is it's worth noting that China is extremely conscious of the fact that its actions on the ground have nothing to do with the rhetoric it is projecting. So really, it does not see a way out of the of its ambitions in terms of security multilateralism. And it realizes that a security multilateralism will actually be limited to the SEO, where it has a relationship with the Russians. And that's where really the military exercises and the military engagements have happened to a large extent. At the global level, of course, China has adhered to the UN as a security provider and a regulator. And in the UN, it has also, together with the BRICS, agreed that the UN's right to protect position is something that they cannot accept. So within the United Nations, while it sees itself as a security provider, it is also at a variance with the consensus in the US on the right to protect initiative, and which basically underlies UN intervention in countries that are in critical conflict. In 2005, and this is interesting, it endorsed Pillar 1 and 2 of the Responsibility to Protect provisions of the United Nations, but it did not endorse Pillar 2, which is the responsibility, which was which allows for the use of force. It suggested instead that there should be an idea of responsible protection. There were no takers for that. And then it backed Brazil's proposal of responsibility while protecting. Again, there were no takers for that. So in military multilateralism, it has basically been a part of the UN peacekeeping force, as we said earlier. But beyond that, China's security initiatives in the United Nations and in other organizations have really been fairly limiting. Okay, so finally, in conclusion, I think it's interesting that China has made some inroads into suggesting alternative multilateral framework, multilateral conceptions, a Chinese way of looking at multilateral institutions, and through that, re-engaging with a new kind of global order. But it has also come up with huge challenges and blowback and pushback from the international community. On the very specifics of multilateral engagements, example for the BRI, for example, it has not had enormous, enormous successes, but given the disarray of the West, and given the fact that China China's position has, at least on inequitable international order, has much resonance amongst developing countries and amongst rising powers, there is a way for China's multilateralism to actually move ahead. Xi Jinping's investment in the leadership role that China now plays in multilateral institutions, old and new, is given that it's unlikely that China's multilateral activism will cease. Even more, given that China's initiatives in the G20, OBOR, BRICS, and the AIB have become central to the narrative of Xi Jinping's foreign policy successes, multilateral policy is likely to stay as one of the 3 pillars of China's foreign policy. However, it is more than likely that Xi will build on current gains to push even harder for governance reforms in older institutions and use China's structural power to change many rules that now govern policy towards the developing world and oversight of financial policy in the developed world. China's evolving multilateral policy has established China's status as a regional leader, not so far as a global leader, and allows it a greater global reach and global political and economic role. So China now speaks with authority at all multilateral institutions, proposes reform and global and regional initiatives that draw states into its ambit. This is an environment that is best suited to Xi Jinping's effort to thwart the rising tide of protectionism in developed economies. A networked Asia and a networked world is critical for the movement of goods and services and prevents markets from closing off to emerging economies. China's new normal, quote unquote, requires economic reform at home, but the difficulties inherent in structural reform also mean that it will seek to replicate much of the tried and tested China model abroad to keep its industries afloat. It is also best suited to China's rise within the structures of multilateral institutions. Xi's argument for global governance reform is consistent with this. While this argument is not new either in Beijing or in capitals in developing countries across the world, it takes on significance at a point when the demand for change comes together with China's economic and political influence. China's dissatisfaction with older multilateral institutions was based on the fact that it did not have the institutional capacity and power to set the rules of multilateral institutions. Factors that give states recourse to structural power and to the ability to shape global politics in their own interests, as the US did since the end of the Second World War. Hence, Chinese policymakers view Xi's policy as intended to shape multilateral processes and diplomacy and to provide a strong impetus to a new international order that is fair and more equitable. So within China, there is a consensus that this is where it is actually headed. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhalla, for that very insightful, very comprehensive lecture on the subject of new multilateralism of Beijing. We are now open to questions and comments from members of the audience.
Very nice outside. I'm sure you don't have any questions. Yes, please.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful lecture. When we talk of China, in a national framework of everything, the transparency, as you said, they are lacking the transparency. But the subject of, integrity and what they speak, they don't, rely upon their promises. Their whole talk is, as you said, is undiplomatic. And very few nations believe in Chinese order. Whether you call it a lateralism, even their companies are not favored in various countries in Europe. Why? Because of their surveillance and other, So my question goes there that if the country doesn't possess the order of integrity or belief, even in themselves, even they are highly tech people, now they are having the best of the weaponry and everything is there. Once they are assigned with Russia, they make a very, formidable sort of a access. But otherwise, China's are to be believed very belittled. So how do you put that in perspective?
Actually, in the realm of international politics, it is very rare for any country to consistently match its rhetoric to its actions. I think we have seen that with the United States. We saw that with what US did in Iraq, right? We have seen that with most countries. I think we have seen that with ourselves as well, although we tried to bridge the gap between rhetoric and action. So to expect the Chinese to, be the leaders in matching this is a little bit much. The reason I say this is also because as China rises, it is also battling, it's also battling the pushback from the world, right? I don't think that any other country apart from Germany and Japan during the period between the First and the Second World War faced that kind of pushback. Certainly the United States did not face that pushback as it rose to world power. In a sense, the US had become a world power by the beginning of the 20th century, although it was more or less recognized after the Second World War. The conditions for China to rise are not as sanguine as the conditions were for the US to rise. And in a sense, because China has a different model, it has a different ideological system, and the West has pitted itself against Marxism or communism for the last century, the Chinese would always be looked at with suspicion unless marketization would lead to democracy, a democratic political order in China. That is not likely to happen. So the ability of the West to deal with different ideological regimes in a peaceful, cooperative fashion is limited and constrained. And we have seen that with the United States. We have seen that not so much with Europe, which is much more pragmatic about it, but certainly with the United States. In a sense, suspicions about China's intention emerge from its different ideological framework. However, what China is doing is what all emerging powers do. When you have power and you are, you're claiming a representative voice in the community of nations, and if there is a pushback, this is what you will do. You will prevaricate. You will also, come forth with a certain rhetoric while your actions will be extremely pragmatic. So within the realm of international politics, what China is doing is not terribly unique, right? It is just that it is unique to our condition today. Because we are also a rising power, or at least we think we are a rising power. There are other rising powers, and we are actually looking at a multipolar world in in many ways. So that everybody wants to have a voice in the way in which the world is going to be shaped. But because China now has this overweening power, it can take this position that the world order is not conducive to my interests. And I think logically, if we did not have a border problem with China, if we didn't have our own skirmishes with China, I think we would accept that, because as developing countries, we have also agreed with China that the world order is an inequitable order. It is a not undemocratic order. In a sense, we have this community of interest with the Chinese. We do not have a community of interest in the security realm. Agreed. And that is what actually complicates our situation with China, which is why we ask these questions about China. And we are very happy to see China in the dock at times, right? But logically speaking, rationally speaking, what China is doing is what all powers do as they attain power. They claim to be part of a dialogue and to shape the rules of the global order.
Any other question?
Ma'am, my question is, what if tomorrow BRI becomes too big to fail? Then, because right now India hasn't joined, because it seems to me that it hasn't become too big to fail. So what if tomorrow it becomes too big to fail, and what kind of leverages that India will have against, other than the Indo-Pacific architecture? Because when it comes to collective action, it seems India is strong, but when it comes that it will have to play its own game, the scene becomes quite heavier for India. So that's my question.
The jury is out on the BRI right now, right? It is an initiative in the making. It is I should say, an event in the making. And what we are getting, what we are getting to hear about the BRI is that while it presents China with many opportunities, it is also increasingly presenting it with a lot of challenges, right? If you look at the first forum on the BRI that China held, it was extremely celebratory. The second forum was a much more quieter, much more reflective affair, where the feedback on the BRI had already come back, and the Chinese understood that they would have to actually put in certain kinds of institutional caveats. They would have to institutionalize some of their interactions on the BRI. They would have to be more transparent, and especially in terms of funding, they would have to be, uh, they would have to be clearer with their counterparts on the nature of funding and on the conditions for funding. And also the environmental impact of the BRI. I think stories have begun to come in on coal-fired plants, on old technologies. So the second forum on the BRI was a much more reflective affair. It certainly was not celebratory. And Xi Jinping's speech at the second BRI forum is very telling in terms of the challenges that China has begun to face on the BRI. So it's not just Western interlocutors or researchers going and seeing that the projects haven't started. This is the feedback that China is also getting from the BRI. A consequence of this has been that China has started what it calls a digital BRI, right? It has also started what it calls a health BRI. So it is diversifying in terms of the needs of their counterparts across the world and beginning to listen to ask what the needs are before they actually invest their money or their resources. Now, the problem though is, and this is very interesting. Now, a couple of years ago, I was at Futan in Shanghai, and I was talking to some of the scholars there, and one of the concerns they had was, they said, we are looking now. I asked them, what are you doing now? So they said, well, of course, the BRI. I said, what about the BRI? So they said, we are looking at studies on why the BRI is attractive to smaller countries, but not to larger powers. Right? So this has now become a concern for China, that it has been accused of working with dictators and fragile polities, taking advantage of, political situations where it can actually impose its conditions, and that the larger powers are actually opposed to the BRI. Now, if China needs to have influence and heft as a consequence of BRI, it needs to have the more influential powers of the world on side on the BRI. So, as I said, China is much more now reflective about this, looking at how it can use the BRI to effectively convey the message that it has arrived and it is shaping the global order.
Before we move on to other questions, I had a couple of my own. Um, you rightly said that when the US was rising as a power, late 19th and early 20th century, it did not face the kind of blowback that China has been facing. But that is precisely the point about the exceptionalism of the US, because first, the geography of US is totally different from that of China. And you see, on the north, it has Canada, with which it had very little conflict. On the south, there was some, no doubt, but most of that was resolved by the end of the 19th century. And then, of course, the Monroe Doctrine, which had been there since the beginning of the 19th century, it had created a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere for the US. So there were no strong neighbors close to the borders of United States, which would be, in a way, you can say, inconvenienced, or they will suffer as a result of the rise of the United States. Of course, this was not the only factor, but right now I'm talking about geography. On the other hand, the complication with China is that China is surrounded by some small countries, but also very many large and powerful countries. And three of the most important countries that it is surrounded by, which are large and powerful by any reckoning, is of course Japan, Russia, and India. And even Vietnam, of course, is not a country to be ignored. What I'm trying to suggest is, as you rightly said in response to that question, that all countries prevaricate. That's a part of foreign policy diplomacy. I agree with that. But the problem here is that so many countries are going to suffer and are already suffering as a result of the way China has been rising. Rise of countries is one thing, but the way China has been rising, especially since 2008, so many countries are suffering. I think that is something to be reckoned with, and that is why the rise of China, in a way, is fundamentally different from the rise of United States. Probably the rise of China can be compared more to the rise of Germany which of course again was surrounded by many significant powers, and balance of power had to be maintained, and that's one reason so many countries ultimately turned against the rise of Germany. I think this also relates to the other question, the other point that you raised at the beginning of your lecture, that China takes a long-term historical view of things, and you talked about the Tianxia rightly. I agree with you that it takes a long-term historical view of things. The problem that I see there is that China has absorbed a certain sinocentric account of world history and of the history of Asia, especially of East Asia, but of Asia as a whole. And it has started believing in the last 100 years or so that it was always the center of the world. And therefore, it is merely reclaiming that position. Whereas in reality, as we know, China was a civilization, large, important, no doubt about it. But still, its geography was not favorable to becoming a world power in the sense in which we use the word today. It was comparatively isolated from the north, and on the south also, you could see that its geography was not as favorable as that of India in terms of trade and commerce. And in fact, the world economic system, I would argue, was probably based more on the Indian Ocean than in the Indo-Pacific as it is described today. So it seems to me that taking long-term historical perspective is fine, but there is a kind of, how should I put it, conflation of the Western propaganda about what China had been and the actual position that China had occupied in world history. Of course, I will not go so far as to say, as Adam Siegel said, the Middle Kingdom is a middle power. He said it 20 years ago. Today, certainly nobody will say it. But the fact remains that China's position in history is much exaggerated. Any serious scholar of history will certainly acknowledge it, and China is drawing upon that narrative. And some of the diplomatic assertion and foreign policy assertion that we see in China today is certainly because of this. But China's geography is different; it is constrained. So, what will be the future?
Very, very large questions here. And I will attempt to engage in a dialogue with you on this one. The first one, that the Americans had a very, a very different environment. So there was no pushback, right? That's what you said, right?
Yeah,
and
very little compared to China.
Okay, if you look at the 19th century history of America, you will find, or let's say even the 18th century history of America, George Washington was very clear when the new American state was formed, nation was formed, that it would have no entangling alliances, right? And these were the terms he used. He said, we don't want the old world in the new world. And the old world was certainly there. I mean, Canada was still a colony of Britain. The Portuguese still had vast tracts of vast interest in Latin America, as did the Spanish, as did the Spaniards. And they didn't want to be caught in that, and as did the French. French Louisiana, America bought it from the French, right? A large tract of land in the heart of the American continent. So America didn't want to be a part of that. And very much like our own non-aligned thing, we get along with everybody. We need to construct our own, world first. So the Americans were certainly surrounded by, ambitious powers that would have laid claim to American lands or the American continent, if they could have done that at that point. Over the years, over the next few decades, some of these powers declined, right? And Britain lost. Britain still had Canada, and Canada and America fought a war. The British and the Americans fought a war in which the White House was burnt down. Yes. Right? It had to be rebuilt. So that of course was the end of that conflict, right, with them. But the Americans also stole the industrial revolution from Europe, right? In the 19th century, they stole textile technology from the British. What they accuse China of doing today, they did that in the 19th century to set up the textile mills in the Massachusetts. It was the beginning of industrialization in America. And they spent that 1 century industrializing. By the end of the century, they were industrial power, not because they produced anything themselves, but because they got immigrant labor, cheap labor from Europe. Both the Irish famine in the mid 19th century and later the Jewish migration from Europe and the Italian migration from Europe. So America built itself up gradually over a century into a very large, very strong industrial power at the time at which British colonialism was actually weakening. Britain was actually weakening and being bled by its colonies, right? So by the beginning of the 20th century, it was very clear that Britain could no longer hold on to its colonies, and it was really in a very dire economic state, right? And America was on the rise. And if you look at what's his name? Not Adam Smith. John Adams, right? Who was Secretary of State in the first decade of the 20th century in America. He said, the baton has passed from Britain to America. The power has now come to America. So there was a very clear, conscious understanding that America was at that time a power on the brink of hegemony. Not hegemony, but at least leadership in the world. And then the two world wars, of course, completely destroyed Europe and whatever power the British had at that point. So the Americans, okay, they were cut off in terms of geography, but they were very much part of what was happening in the Western world, both the old world and the new world. Okay, the Chinese, in one sense, have not had such a bad environment. Okay, and a negative environment. For one, it had all of Southeast Asia and East Asia to bank on in terms of its initial economic growth. Okay, much of the investments that China made, that came to China in the beginning of the reform period, actually came from the Southeast Asian nations and the overseas Chinese, right? It got investments from Japan, it got investments from South Korea, it got investments from Taiwan. So really the Chinese were in a very good geographical, kind of environment where it had the support in its own economic reforms and its own early economic developments after 1978 from all of its neighbors. Not only that, there is China today is so closely intertwined with the Southeast Asian and East Asian economies that it actually drives their growth, right? So it's not as if China is out and out an enemy or somebody that they see with extreme anxiety. What they look at with anxiety is that China combines both its economic, the fallouts of its economic growth, the positive fallouts of its economic growth, with its irredentist policy, territorial irredentist policy. And that is what creates the problems for all of these states, because there is no clarity on that. And China's recourse to historical interpretation of its claims becomes a very vague, opaque, and discriminatory basis.
By the Chinese standards, we could probably claim Afghanistan and Myanmar, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You can go back 200 years.
Yeah.
You can go back 1500 years, and I could say that I could claim, a house in Central Asia. I mean, that's where we came from. Who knows,
yes.
Right? So, you can't reverse history, but Chinese have been reversing history in that sense.
Yes, and that's a fundamental sort of trait of the rising Chinese nationalism. Anyway, thank you. I think there are no further questions, and we have reached the end of this lecture today. I take this opportunity to thank Professor Madhu Bhalla for this marvelous lecture, and I thank all members of the audience for their enthusiastic participation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and really thank you for your patience, and thank you for sitting and listening to me on a very lovely afternoon.